The silence in the watchtower stretched like a held breath before thunder. Captain Nix Castellanos pressed her eye to the spotting scope, scanning the desert horizon where heat waves danced like ghosts above the sand. The forward operating base below hummed with the lazy rhythm of a Tuesday afternoon in Kandahar province. Mechanics tinkering with helicopters, supply trucks kicking up dust clouds, soldiers moving with the unhurried pace of men who believed themselves safe behind concrete barriers and razor wire. But Nix had learned long ago that the desert kept its secrets, until the moment it chose to reveal them. The radio crackled to life. "Overwatch, this is Tower Base. Anything on your scope?" "Negative contact," she replied, though something gnawed at her instincts like a splinter under skin. "All quiet on the Western Front." Sergeant Morrison's voice carried that familiar note of barely concealed condescension. "Roger that, Duchess. Keep your eyes open for the boogeyman." The call sign had followed her across 3 deployments. Duchess, because she'd graduated from the Air Force Academy, because she spoke with precision instead of slang, because she'd been born with a name that sounded like mythology instead of a Midwestern town. They thought it was mockery. She'd learned to wear it like armor. The A-10 Thunderbolt II appeared first as a speck against the crystalline blue, flying low and fast from the southeast. The distinctive twin engines and straight wings of the Warthog were unmistakable, even at distance. Nix tracked it through her scope, noting the aircraft's unusual flight path, too low for a routine patrol, too aggressive for a simple reconnaissance run. Then the impossible happened. The Warthog banked hard left, its nose swinging around until it pointed directly at her watchtower. For a heartbeat that stretched into eternity, pilot and observer stared at each other across miles of empty air. The aircraft hung there, suspended like a predator deciding whether to strike, its GAU-8 cannon pointed at the base like an accusation. "Tower Base, we have a problem," Nix said, her voice steady despite the ice forming in her chest. "Unknown A-10 inbound, bearing 270, altitude approximately Angels 2. Aircraft is not responding to identification protocols." "Say again, Overwatch. Did you say unknown A-10? The Warthog rolled inverted and dove toward the base like a falling star. Nix could see the pilot's helmet now, could almost imagine the eyes behind the visor. Whoever was flying that aircraft knew exactly what they were doing. "Tower Base, this is Overwatch. We are about to have a very bad day." The morning sun caught the Warthog's wings as it screamed toward them, casting a shadow that raced across the desert floor like the herald of something terrible approaching. In that shadow, Nix saw the ghost of her own past rising to meet her. The war had found them at last. Major Elena Vasquez materialized beside the radio console like smoke given form, her flight suit still bearing the sweat stains of a training sortie cut short. She'd been the kind of pilot who could make an Apache helicopter dance like a ballerina and sing like a chainsaw, back when she still had both hands and the nerve to pull triggers. Now she served as operations officer, moving pieces on the board instead of being one herself. "Talk to me, Duchess," she said, snatching the handset from Morrison's fumbling fingers. "What exactly are we looking at?" Through the scope, Nix watched the A-10 level out barely 50 feet above the desert floor, its massive cannon pointed at the fuel depot like a finger of judgment. The pilot maintained perfect formation flying, too perfect for someone who'd lost their mind, too disciplined for a terrorist who'd stolen military hardware. "Single A-10, unmarked flying tactical approach patterns," Nix reported. "Pilot appears highly skilled. No radio response to standard hails." "IFF transponder." "Negative. Aircraft is squawking emergency codes, but the signature doesn't match any of our birds." Elena keyed the radio. "Unknown A-10, this is Kandahar Tower Base Actual. You are approaching restricted airspace. Identify yourself immediately or be considered hostile." Static answered her. The Warthog pulled up into a climbing turn, revealing the underside of its fuselage. Even at distance, Nix could see that something was wrong with the aircraft's markings. Where squadron insignias should have been, there were only faded patches of paint, as if someone had tried to erase the plane's identity with sandpaper and desperation. "Major," Nix said quietly, "I need you to look at something." Alina pressed her eye to the secondary scope. For a long moment she said nothing. When she finally spoke, her voice carried the weight of recognition. "Jesus Christ, that's tail number 780684. Morrison looked up from his console. "What's special about 684? "It was shot down over Syria 18 months ago," Alina whispered. "The pilot was listed KIA. We held a memorial service." The implications hung in the air like cordite smoke. A dead pilot flying a dead plane, approaching their base with the patience of someone who had all the time in the world and nothing left to lose. The Warthog completed its turn and began another approach, lower this time, slow enough that Nix could see the pilot's hand resting on the stick. "Tower Base, this is Colonel Patterson," came a new voice over the radio, sharp with authority. "What's your situation report?" Alina's jaw tightened. Patterson, the kind of career officer who measured success in PowerPoint slides and viewed combat pilots as expensive, unreliable equipment. "Sir, we have an unidentified A-10 conducting unauthorized approaches. Aircraft appears to be 780684, which was presumed destroyed." "Presumed destroyed aircraft don't fly, Major. Get me facts, not ghost stories." Through her scope, Nix watched the Warthog's canopy slide open. A gloved hand emerged and dropped something that fluttered in the slipstream like a dying bird. "A piece of paper." "Major," Nix said, "the pilot just dropped something. Message drop looks like." The paper spiraled down through the desert air, carried by winds that had blown across this same sand for 1,000 years. It landed 50 meters outside the perimeter fence, close enough to retrieve but far enough away to make the gesture unmistakably deliberate. Alina was already moving toward the stairs. "Morrison, you have the watch. Duchess, you're with me." They found the paper weighted down with a spent 30 shell casing, the kind fired by an A-10's cannon. Alina unfolded it with hands that had learned steadiness in cockpits but trembled now with something deeper than fear. The message was written in block letters with a ballpoint pen that had nearly run dry. "They told you I was dead. They were wrong. Need to talk. Trust no one else. CALLSIGN Phoenix." Below the words was a hand-drawn map showing a coordinates grid and the outline of a dried riverbed 20 kilometers north of the base. At the bottom, barely legible, were the words, "Come alone, Nix. You're the only one who remembers Ballad." Alina looked up from the paper, her face pale as bleached bone. "Phoenix was Captain Rebecca Torres. We flew together in Iraq. She saved my life over Ballad Air Base." "And now she's supposedly dead," Nix said, watching the A-10 circle overhead like a patient vulture. "The question is," Alina murmured, "what killed her the first time?" The radio crackled with Patterson's voice, sharp with impatience. "Major Vasquez, I want that aircraft intercepted. Scramble the Alert 5 birds." Alina stared at the message in her hands, then at the circling Warthog. In the desert, trust was a luxury few could afford, but betrayal was a poison that killed slowly and completely. She'd learned both lessons the hard way. "Sir," she said into the handset, "I recommend we establish communication before taking aggressive action." "Your recommendation is noted and rejected. Launch the F-16s." Nix felt the familiar tightness in her chest that came before violence. The kind of tension that made good soldiers into casualties and careful planners into casualties who saw it coming. Patterson was about to turn a mystery into a tragedy, and she was powerless to stop it. The Alert 5 F-16s thundered off the runway like angry hornets, their afterburners painting the sky with twin contrails of fury. From her position in the Watchtower, Nix could see everything. the Warthog maintaining its lazy circle, the Vipers climbing rapidly to intercept altitude, and the moment when someone with a dead woman's call sign would have to choose between surrender and something much worse. Falcon lead, this is Tower. Contact bearing 090 Angels 5 slow mover. Intercept and identify. Roger Tower, Falcon lead has contact. Approaching from the south. Elena stood frozen beside the radio console, the message from Phoenix still clutched in her white-knuckled grip. Nix could see the war playing out behind her eyes, the weight of command versus the debt of friendship, military protocol versus the terrible possibility that someone they'd buried in their hearts was still alive and asking for help. Major, Nix said quietly, "What happened at Ballad?" "Surface-to-air missile took out my tail rotor. I was going down hard over hostile territory." Elena's voice carried the flat tone of someone reciting trauma like a weather report. "Phoenix came in under heavy fire and covered my crash landing. Took shrapnel through her canopy. Should have died." The lead F-16 closed to within a mile of the A-10, and suddenly the impossible aircraft began to climb. Not the desperate climb of someone trying to escape, but the methodical ascent of a pilot who knew exactly what they were doing and had been waiting for this moment. Falcon lead to Tower, Bandit is climbing and turning north, speed increasing to military power. Colonel Patterson's voice cut through the radio chatter like a blade. "Falcon lead, you are authorized to engage if target maintains hostile course." "Sir, wait," Elena started to protest, but Patterson had already switched frequencies. The rolled inverted at the top of its climb and dove toward the deck, its distinctive silhouette painted against the pale blue sky like a cross between heaven and earth. Whoever Phoenix really was, she flew that machine like it was part of her body, pulling maneuvers that should have been impossible for an aircraft designed to be a flying tank rather than a fighter. Nix pressed her eye to the scope and watched the aerial ballet unfold. The F-16s had speed and altitude, but the Warthog had something more dangerous, a pilot who had nothing left to lose and everything to prove. The aircraft skimmed the desert floor so low its jet wash kicked up sand devils, weaving between hills and wadis with the precision of someone who had mapped every stone. "She's heading for the coordinates on the map," Nix realized. "The riverbed." Elena grabbed the radio handset. "All stations, this is Tower Base Actual. Falcon flight, break off pursuit. Repeat, break off pursuit." "Negative Tower, we have our orders." In the distance, Nix could see the dry riverbed carved into the desert like an ancient scar. The A-10 disappeared into the wadi, using the terrain to mask its approach to whatever lay hidden in that desolate place. The F-16s circled overhead like frustrated sharks, unable to follow their prey into the maze of stone and shadow below. And then, for a moment that stretched like eternity, the desert fell silent. The explosion, when it came, lit the horizon like a small sun. The shockwave arrived seconds later, rattling windows and setting off car alarms across the base. A pillar of black smoke rose from the coordinates Phoenix had marked on her hand-drawn map, climbing toward the sky like a funeral pyre. "Jesus," Morrison whispered, "what the hell was out there?" Elena stared at the smoke column, her face a mask of controlled grief. "I don't know, but Rebecca Torres just died for it." Nix lowered her scope, but the image remained burned into her retinas. A lone aircraft disappearing into the earth in a bloom of fire and dust. In the silence that followed, she could hear the desert wind singing through the Watchtower's steel framework, carrying the smell of cordite and burning fuel across the empty miles. The radio crackled with damage reports and requests for emergency vehicles, but Nix found herself listening instead to the absence of a voice she'd never heard, but somehow recognized. Phoenix had risen from the dead just long enough to die again, and the only witnesses were the buzzards and the wind. "Falcon lead to Tower," came the pilot's voice, subdued now. "We have a confirmed kill. Target is down." Elena set down the handset and walked to the window, staring out at the column of smoke that marked the end of Rebecca Torres for the second and final time. "No," she said quietly. "Target accomplished the mission." But what mission? Nix wondered, and for whom? The questions hung in the air like the smoke on the horizon, and she had the terrible feeling that Phoenix's death was not an ending but a beginning. The recovery team reached the crash site as the sun began its descent toward the western mountains. From the Watchtower, Nix watched the convoy of Humvees and medical vehicles disappear into the heat shimmer, carrying investigators and body bags toward whatever Phoenix had died to reveal. Alina paced the small room like a caged animal, the message from Phoenix still clutched in her fist. Every few minutes she would unfold it, read it again, then crumple it back into her palm as if the words might change through repetition. "Major," Morrison said carefully, "Colonel Patterson wants your after-action report within the hour. Tell Patterson he can have my report when I understand what the hell just happened." The radio squawked with field reports from the crash site. "Tower Base, this is Recovery 1. We have wreckage from an A-10, serial number 7080684 confirmed. But sir, there's something else out here." Alina grabbed the handset. "Recovery 1, this is Tower Base Actual. What do you mean something else?" "Ma'am, we've got what looks like a bunker complex built into the Wadi wall. Recent construction, well camouflaged. The A-10 impact opened it up like a can opener." Nix felt her blood chill. Phoenix hadn't been running from the F-16s. She'd been delivering a guided missile strike against a target that shouldn't have existed. A target hidden 20 kilometers from a U.S. military base, invisible to satellite surveillance and buried in terrain that appeared empty on every map. "Recovery 1, do not approach the bunker. Repeat, maintain safe distance until EOD arrives." "Too late for that, ma'am. We've already found the entrance. Tower Base, you need to see this." The images came through on the secure data link 30 minutes later. Nick stared at the laptop screen, trying to process what the recovery team's cameras had captured in the artificial twilight of the bunker complex. Rows of server racks hummed in climate-controlled chambers, communications equipment that looked far too sophisticated for a forward operating base in Afghanistan. And everywhere, the distinctive angular script of Chinese military markings. "It's a listening post," Alina breathed. "They've been monitoring everything, our communications, our flight plans, our operational security." Colonel Patterson materialized in the Watchtower without warning, his face grim as winter dawn. Behind him came two men in civilian clothes who had the kind of bland faces that suggested they were anything but civilians. "Major Vasquez," Patterson said, "you're relieved of duty pending investigation." "Sir, I don't understand." "Captain Torres was declared killed in action 18 months ago in Syria. Her body was recovered. Her funeral was held at Arlington. Yet somehow she managed to fly a stolen aircraft to attack what appears to be a foreign intelligence installation 20 kilometers from this base." Patterson's voice was ice-cold professional. "Someone is going to explain to me how a dead woman knew about enemy assets that our own intelligence services missed." One of the civilians stepped forward. "Major, we'll need to debrief you about your relationship with Captain Torres. Specifically, any contact you may have had with her after her supposed death." Nix watched Alina's face harden into a mask of military bearing. "I had no contact with Captain Torres after her death was reported. The first indication that she might be alive was the message she dropped this afternoon." "The message you failed to report through proper channels," the second civilian observed. "The message I received 30 minutes before she was shot down by our own fighters," Alina replied evenly. Patterson gestured toward the door. "Major, you'll come with us now. Morrison, you have the watch." As they led Alina away, she caught Nix's eye and mouthed a single word: "Remember." Alone in the Watchtower, Nix stared out at the desert where the smoke had finally dissipated, leaving only the endless blue sky and the whisper of wind through sand. Phoenix had risen from the dead to deliver one final mission, but the cost of that revelation was destroying the life of the only person who might have understood why. In the distance, she could see more convoys heading toward the crash site, investigators and intelligence officers and people whose job it was to bury secrets as deep as the desert buried bones. The radio crackled with routine traffic, but Nix wasn't listening anymore. She was thinking about a woman named Rebecca Torres who had chosen to die twice rather than let her enemies believe they were safe. And she was wondering what other secrets might be hidden beneath the endless, patient sand. As night fell over Kandahar province, Nix began to understand that Phoenix's death was not the end of the story. It was the prologue. 3 weeks later, Nix found herself sitting across from a Pentagon investigation board in a windowless room that smelled of industrial coffee and bureaucratic anxiety. The 5 officers behind the polished table wore the kind of expressions that suggested they'd already reached their conclusions and were merely going through the motions of due process. "Captain Castellanos," the board president began, "you were the primary observer during the incident in question. Walk us through your assessment of the pilot's behavior." Nix had rehearsed this moment, knowing that every word would be weighed against Alina's career and Phoenix's legacy. The pilot demonstrated exceptional skill and tactical awareness. The approach patterns suggested extensive familiarity with both the aircraft and the operational environment. In your opinion, was this the behavior of a hostile actor? The question hung in the air like smoke from a dying fire. Nix thought about Phoenix's message, about the bunker full of Chinese surveillance equipment, about Alina sitting in a holding cell somewhere in the Pentagon's basement. Truth was a luxury in rooms like this, but lies were a poison that killed slowly. "No, sir. In my assessment, Captain Torres was conducting a reconnaissance mission against an enemy installation." The board president's eyebrows rose slightly. "Captain Torres was declared killed in action 18 months ago. Dead pilots don't conduct reconnaissance missions." "Dead pilots also don't fly precision strikes against hidden enemy positions," Nix replied. "Yet the evidence suggests Captain Torres did exactly that." One of the board members leaned forward. "Are you suggesting that Captain Torres faked her own death?" "I'm suggesting that we don't have all the facts. The existence of that Chinese listening post proves our intelligence was compromised. Captain Torres may have discovered something that required her to operate outside normal channels." "Outside normal channels" is a generous way to describe desertion and aircraft theft, another officer observed. Nix felt her temper flare but kept her voice level. "Sir, with respect, Captain Torres destroyed an enemy intelligence asset that had been operating undetected for months or years. Whatever her methods, she succeeded where our conventional intelligence failed." The board president made a note on his tablet. "Captain, your loyalty to your fellow officers is commendable. However, we must follow the evidence where it leads. The evidence suggests that Captain Torres was involved in activities that may have compromised operational security." "What activities?" "That information is classified above your clearance level." The hearing continued for 2 more hours, covering the same ground with the methodical persistence of investigators who had already decided what they wanted to hear. Nix answered their questions with growing frustration, watching them construct a narrative that painted Phoenix as a rogue agent rather than a hero who had died twice in service to her country. When they finally dismissed her, Nix walked out of the Pentagon into the gray October afternoon feeling like she just buried her friend all over again. Alina remained in custody, facing court-martial proceedings. Phoenix's real death had been classified out of existence, replaced by an official story about equipment failure and pilot error. The truth had become inconvenient, so it had been edited. But as Nix stood on the steps of the Pentagon, watching traffic flow along the Potomac, she made a decision that would change everything. Phoenix had trusted her enough to include her name in that final message. Elena had risked her career to protect her. The least she could do was ensure their sacrifice meant something. She pulled out her phone and dialed a number she'd memorized but never used. Washington Post, Investigative Desk. This is Marcus Chen. Mr. Chen, my name is Captain Nix Castellanos. I have a story about a dead pilot who just saved American lives, and a Pentagon cover-up that's about to bury the truth. The silence on the other end of the line stretched for several heartbeats. When Chen finally spoke, his voice carried the cautious interest of a reporter who'd learned to recognize truth in a city built on lies. Captain, are you sure you want to do this? Going public against the Pentagon can end careers. Nix looked back at the massive building behind her, its 5 sides containing more secrets than any structure had a right to hold. Somewhere in those corridors, Elena was fighting for her freedom. Somewhere in the classified files, Phoenix's real story was being rewritten by people who had never heard a shot fired in anger. Mr. Chen, she said, some stories are worth ending careers for. Then let's talk. The story broke on a Sunday morning when the Pentagon's public relations machine was running on skeleton crew. Chen had spent 2 weeks verifying Nix's account, cross-referencing satellite imagery, and tracking down sources who could speak anonymously about the Chinese listening post that had been quietly dismantled after Phoenix's final mission. The headline read, "Dead pilot's final flight exposed enemy surveillance network. Pentagon covers up hero's sacrifice." Nix read the article in her apartment, drinking coffee that had gone cold, while she absorbed seeing her own words in print. Chen had been careful to protect her identity, while building an irrefutable case that Phoenix had died conducting legitimate counterintelligence operations rather than going rogue. Her phone rang before she finished the second paragraph. Captain Castellanos, this is General Patricia Hayes, Pentagon Public Affairs. I think we need to talk. By Tuesday, Elena had been released from custody with all charges dropped. By Wednesday, the Senate Armed Services Committee had announced hearings into intelligence failures that allowed foreign surveillance assets to operate near U.S. military installations. By Friday, Colonel Patterson had been quietly reassigned to a logistics position in Ohio. The official story changed with the bureaucratic speed of an avalanche. Captain Rebecca Torres was posthumously awarded the Distinguished Flying Cross for actions that had previously been classified as desertion. The Chinese listening post became a significant counterintelligence victory rather than an embarrassing oversight. But for Nix, the real victory came in a brief phone call from Elena, whose voice carried something it hadn't held in years: peace. She did it, Elena said simply. Phoenix accomplished what she set out to do. The truth is finally out there. What happens now? Now we remember her correctly, not as the woman who died in Syria, but as the pilot who rose from the dead to save lives one more time. Nix hung up the phone and walked to her window, looking out at the Virginia countryside where the autumn leaves were turning colors that reminded her of fire and gold. In the distance, she could hear the sound of jets taking off from Andrews Air Force Base, pilots who would never know that their security had been purchased with the life of a woman who had already died once for her country. Phoenix had chosen her call sign well. She had risen from the ashes of her own death to burn away the lies that threatened those she'd sworn to protect. And in doing so, she had reminded everyone who knew her story that sometimes the only way to serve truth is to sacrifice everything else. The sun was setting when Nix received the final message. It came through official channels this time, a commendation from the Secretary of Defense recognizing her exceptional courage in bringing critical intelligence failures to light through appropriate channels. She laughed at the careful phrasing, the way bureaucracy transformed defiance into compliance after the fact. But the medal that came with the commendation bore an inscription that someone with influence had added despite regulations. in memory of Captain Rebecca Torres, call sign Phoenix, who died twice so others might live. Nix held the medal up to the fading light, watching the gold catch fire in the sunset. Somewhere out there, other pilots were flying missions they would never be able to discuss, making sacrifices that would never appear in official records, dying deaths that might not be recognized until years later when the classified files were finally opened. Phoenix had been one of them, a guardian angel with afterburners, watching over a world that would never fully understand the price of its safety. The watchtower stood empty now, its windows reflecting the last light of day across the Afghan desert. Nix had rotated back to the States, Alina had taken a new assignment training pilots, and Morrison had been promoted to Master Sergeant with a commendation for his role in the Phoenix incident. But in the minds of those who had been there, the watchtower would always be the place where a dead woman had returned to deliver one final gift to the living, the truth, wrapped in fire and delivered at the cost of everything she had left to give. The desert wind sang through the empty structure, carrying the sound across miles of sand and stone to where other watchtowers stood sentinel against the darkness. In each one, observers scanned the horizon for threats that might come from any direction, at any time, in any form. They were the inheritors of Phoenix's legacy, the ones who watched so others could sleep, who remained vigilant so others could live in peace, who stood ready to sacrifice everything for people who would never know their names. And sometimes, when the light was just right and the wind carried echoes from the past, they might glimpse the shadow of an A-10 Thunderbolt banking against the sunset, its pilot's hand raised in a final salute to those who would carry on the mission, long after the last radio call had faded into static. Phoenix had risen, Phoenix had flown, Phoenix had died as she had lived, protecting others with her life. And in the end, that was the only victory that mattered. The memorial service for Captain Rebecca Torres was held on a crisp November morning at Arlington National Cemetery. Nick stood at attention among the other mourners, watching the honor guard fold the flag that had draped Phoenix's empty coffin. There were no remains this time. Those had been lost in the Syrian desert 18 months earlier, but the ceremony felt more real than the first funeral had been. Alina delivered the eulogy, her voice carrying clearly across the assembled crowd of pilots, ground crews, and family members who had loved Rebecca Torres before she became Phoenix. She spoke of courage and sacrifice, of a pilot who had given everything twice to protect the people she'd sworn to defend. Rebecca chose her call sign because she believed that some things were worth rising from the ashes for, Alina said. Today we honor not just her sacrifice, but her reminder that the mission always comes first, especially when the mission is protecting the truth. After the ceremony, as the crowd dispersed among the white headstones, Alina approached Nix with a small wooden box in her hands. "This was in Rebecca's personal effects from Syria," she said. "I thought you should have it." Inside the box was a pair of pilot's wings, worn smooth by years of wear, and a photograph of a young woman in flight gear standing beside an A-10 Thunderbolt. On the back, in faded ink, someone had written, "For those who watch the watchtowers, RT." Nix closed the box and looked out across the sea of white markers that stretched to the horizon. Each one represented someone who had made the same choice Phoenix had made, to put service before self, mission before safety, truth before convenience. "She knew," Nix said quietly. "Somehow she knew you'd give this to me." "Rebecca always was 3 steps ahead of everyone else," Alina replied. "Even in death she was still planning for the future." They walked together through the cemetery, past the graves of airmen and soldiers, sailors and Marines who had all written their names in the same book of sacrifice that Phoenix had finally closed. The November wind carried the scent of fallen leaves and distant rain, reminding them that even in this place of endings, the seasons continued their eternal cycle of death and rebirth. As they reached the parking area, Alina paused beside her car. "Nix, I want you to know, what you did going public with the story, it took more courage than flying combat missions. You saved Rebecca's legacy. I just told the truth. In this town, that's the most dangerous thing you can do. Nix watched Elena drive away, then stood for a long moment looking back at the cemetery where Phoenix now rested beneath a headstone that finally told her real story. The inscription read simply, Captain Rebecca Torres, United States Air Force, call sign Phoenix. She rose so others might soar. The sun was setting behind the Washington Monument as Nix finally left Arlington, carrying the box with Phoenix's wings and the weight of a promise she was only beginning to understand. Phoenix had died to protect the truth, but the living had a responsibility to ensure that truth meant something. In her apartment that night, Nix placed the worn pilot's wings on her desk next to her own insignia. Two sets of wings, representing two different kinds of flight, Phoenix's aerial ballet of death and resurrection, and her own earthbound vigil in watchtowers and observation posts. But both had been in service of the same mission, watching for threats that others couldn't see, standing guard against dangers that preferred to hide in shadows and silence. The phone rang, interrupting her thoughts. The voice on the other end was young, nervous, and carried the distinctive accent of someone from the rural South. Captain Castellanos, this is Lieutenant Sarah Mitchell, 23rd Fighter Wing. I read the story about Captain Torres. I think I need to talk to someone about something I saw over Syria last month. Something that doesn't match the official reports. Nix closed her eyes and felt the weight of history settling on her shoulders. Phoenix's final mission was expanding into something larger, a network of truth-tellers and watchers who refused to let important stories disappear into classified files and bureaucratic convenience. "Lieutenant," she said, "why don't you tell me what you saw?" And as young Sarah Mitchell began to speak, Nix understood that Phoenix's greatest victory hadn't been destroying the Chinese listening post or exposing the Pentagon cover-up. It had been creating a legacy that would outlive them all, a reminder that some truths were worth dying for and others were worth living for. The watchtower had been empty for months, but the watch continued. Years later, when military historians wrote about the Phoenix incident, they would focus on the intelligence failures and the policy changes that followed. They would analyze the tactical decisions and the geopolitical implications of foreign surveillance networks operating near American military installations. But they would miss the real story, the one that lived in the hearts of pilots who had learned to watch the sky with different eyes, in the minds of intelligence officers who questioned convenient narratives, in the courage of young lieutenants who chose truth over career advancement. Phoenix had died so that others might fly safely, and in doing so, she had created something more valuable than any intelligence report or tactical victory. She had created hope. Hope that someone was always watching. Hope that the truth would eventually find its way into the light. Hope that sacrifice meant something, even when it happened in silence and shadow. The watchtower stands empty now, but the watch continues. In every observation post and radar station, in every cockpit and command center, Phoenix's heirs maintain their vigil. They are the guardians of the truth, the watchers in the darkness, the ones who rise so others might soar. And sometimes, when the light is just right and the wind carries memories across the desert sand, you might see the shadow of an A-10 Thunderbolt banking against the sunset, a reminder that some flights never end, some missions never conclude, and some pilots never truly land. Phoenix rose from the ashes twice, but her legend soars forever, carried on the wings of those who remember that the highest calling of any warrior is not to defeat enemies, but to protect the innocent and defend the truth. In the end, that was Captain Rebecca Torres' final gift to the world, the knowledge that even in death, a pilot's work is never done. The mission continues, passed from one generation to the next, each new guardian of the sky carrying forward the promise that someone will always be watching, Always be ready, always willing to rise when rising is what the mission requires. The watchtower may be empty, but the watch is eternal. And somewhere in the vast blue sky, Phoenix is still flying home,